Farage wants a baby boom. Yeah, Nigel Farage, the same man who once lambasted the so-called welfare culture and mocked the idea of the state supporting people who were, in his words, too fat, too stupid, too lazy, is now rebranding himself as Britain's post-natalist-in-chief, which vision of prams, pacifiers and patriotic procreation lighting the path toward national renewal. And no, this is not satire. Less than 2 years after berating the public for leaning too heavily on state support, Farage is now championing the removal of the two-child benefit cap, a policy shift that would lift hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. So long, of course, as those British children belong to what he calls British families. Because, make no mistake, this isn't a universalist pitch for child welfare. It's a targeted demographic project wrapped in a Union Jack and carrying the distinct aroma of Viktor Orban's Hungary, where anti-immigration policies go hand in hand with anti-abortion rhetoric, and where tax breaks are granted not simply for raising kids, but for raising the right kind of kids. At a recent press conference, Farage made his intentions crystal clear. This was about boosting birth rates among native-born Brits, not those that come into the country and suddenly decide to have a lot of children. And that's when the baby boom stops being about children and starts being about borders. This is what you might call the Orban playbook. Part nationalism, part natalism, and entirely focused on manufacturing a future population that fits an imagined cultural ideal, one that doesn't require immigration to fill its labor force, one that doesn't alter the country's ethnic balance, and one that conveniently ignores the glaring reality of modern demographic economics. But Farage isn't stopping at benefits reform. He's also throwing in more generous tax breaks for married couples. Again, the right kind of couples, and is floating the idea of restricting abortion, calling the 24-week legal limit ludicrous, a term that's as emotionally charged as its policy void. It's a move that sends a signal not just to Britain's socially conservative voters, but to the international coalition of right-wing strategists who see cultural wedge issues as the quickest route to political influence. Because here's the thing. Abortion wasn't always on Farage's radar. For the better part of his political career, he barely mentioned it. But now, as he pivots from Brexit to birth rates, he seems to have discovered that reproductive politics offers a whole new front in the culture war. One where you can talk about British decline, national values, and civilizational strength, and that all without ever mentioning GDP. And if that sounds familiar, it's because we've seen it before. Across Europe and the US, far-right movements have begun to fuse anti-immigration policies with attacks on reproductive rights, all under the guise of defending traditional families, protecting national identity, and resisting so-called replacement. And that's not just theoretical. Investigative journalist Sean Norris has spent years tracing these connections between anti-abortion rhetoric, white nationalist ideology, and the conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement. She's found that many of these groups, some overtly far-right, others hiding behind family values branding, share the same talking points: that immigration is a threat, that feminism is weakening society, and that white women are failing their patriotic duty by not producing enough children. It's the sort of ideological stew that blends misogyny with xenophobia and then sweetens it with just enough economic incentives to call it policy. In the UK, groups like the UK Life League and Britain First have long peddled these narratives, fusing apocalyptic warnings about low birth rates with eerie images of hijabi-clad women in maternity wards and white women in abortion clinics, all accompanied by slogans accusing them of national betrayal. And Farage, knowingly or not, is now borrowing their lexicon. When he talks about wanting more British babies and explicitly excludes migrant families from that vision, he's not just advocating a tax policy. He's signaling a worldview, one in which demographic decline is framed as existential, and where the answer lies not in inclusion or adaptation, but in reproduction, by the right people in the right way for the right reasons. And this is why, despite Farage's sudden concern for child poverty, his critics aren't buying the compassion. Because if it were really about lifting children out of poverty, there would be no distinction drawn between British and non-British families, no caveats about who deserves help and who doesn't. But instead, the policy is wrapped in qualifiers, and those qualifiers make it clear. This is about engineering a national future that looks like the past, not building a fairer present. It's also why his views on abortion are causing alarm. The 24-week limit is rarely reached in practice. Less than 1% of abortions in the UK happen after 20 weeks, and those that do are almost always due to severe fetal abnormalities or serious threats to the mother's health. Yet Farage knows that few issues inflame opinion like abortion. By focusing on the most extreme and emotionally charged cases, he can force a polarized debate, casting supporters of reproductive rights as defenders of infanticide, while presenting himself as the guardian of morality and tradition. It's a page ripped straight from the American right, where incremental restrictions are passed not through outright bans, but through chipping away at time limits, introduction of mandatory counseling, or requiring ultrasounds. And each step seems reasonable in isolation, but collectively, they erode the foundation of reproductive autonomy. And Norris warns that the same playbook is now being unrolled in the UK, with US-backed Christian charities funding campaigns and parliamentary debates already scheduled to test the political waters. Farage, meanwhile, is positioning himself as the vanguard of this new cultural frontier. Not just the Brexit guy anymore, but the man who will stop the decline, restore Britishness, and rally the nation, not through unity, but through wombs. And yet, for all the noise, the numbers tell a different story. The UK has consistently expanded abortion rights over the past decade, from decriminalisation in Northern Ireland to the legislation of telemedicine to the introduction of buffer zones around clinics. Public support for abortion remains strong, with over 90% of Britons supporting access in at least some circumstances. And while the anti-abortion movement is growing louder, it remains small. Even globally, the trend has been toward liberalization. Argentina, Mexico, and over 60 countries in the past 30 years have expanded abortion access, while only 4 have rolled it back. So yes, Farage wants a British baby boom, but he doesn't want it to come from choice or empowerment. He wants it born of ideology, of engineered incentives for certain families, silence for others, and control over women's bodies dressed up as demographic concern. He wants to make reproduction a nationalist duty. And if that sounds familiar, it's because we've seen what happens when political movements start counting babies to measure the strength of the nation. And I know what I'm talking about when I say Mother's Cross. This is not just about helping the poor, it's about designing the future. And the question now isn't just whether Farage will succeed, it's whether Britain will realize the true cost of his baby boom before it becomes the next front in its long and bitter culture war. And if you want to see another video, the next one is right here in the end screen.